Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about traumatic memories. So, traumatic memories are often really confusing. Sometimes people remember pieces of the event, sometimes people remember the whole event, sometimes people remember nothing, sometimes they just remember emotions and feelings. Memories of traumatic events can come in the form of flashbacks and nightmares, and they're often very disjointed and kind of confusing. There's usually not a strong narrative, like start to finish story to the stuff that comes up when you're thinking about traumatic memories, which was something that I thought was really interesting as I was kind of going through my own journey with traumatic memories. And I love to research things and I love to figure out why that is. So, in today's video, I'm going to share a little bit with you about what I've learned about how traumatic memories are stored in the brain and how that affects the way that we remember things. So, to start, we're going to be thinking a little bit about what happens in the brain when you experience a traumatic event. So, basically, kind of in very vague terms, your brain gets flooded with neurochemicals, and they take this memory and they give it to the emotional side of your brain. When it's there, it's completely cut off from the logical and reasoning side of your brain. And that's why the memories can be so painful because there's no logic and there's no reasoning to kind of help us get through whatever we are experiencing. Once the traumatic event has occurred, the memory itself is usually stored in the amygdala. So, the amygdala is responsible for feeling emotions and determining their intensity. So, this is kind of what helps us decide if something is just kind of scary or if something is life threatening. So, that way we know how to get ourselves out of a situation and when we need to do that. With the memory mostly being stored there, some pieces of it are stored in other emotional areas of our brain, and that's part of why it makes us hard to connect them because they're physically separated in different areas of the brain. And the amygdala itself does not store the memory as a full and complete narrative. It just stores the information that's experienced from the five senses during the traumatic event. So this is why sometimes we experience triggers of a traumatic event that seem really small. Like something as small as the way something smells might trigger in your brain similar feelings or flashbacks related to a traumatic event because, again, these memories are stored in a place where they can only be thought about through what our five senses have experienced. So, again, during the traumatic event, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that is responsible for rational thinking, usually shuts down. So, when this part shuts down, that's what puts us into a fight, flight, or freeze response. I do have a video on the freeze response that I will link at the end of this video if you're interested in learning a little bit more about traumatic responses. But during the shutdown, the brain becomes very disorganized. So that's kind of why the memories get stored in these different areas, that they're not really connected. Um, During the shutdown, the rational thinking side of your brain is just completely cut off from them. So the memories aren't really stored in a place that we have access to a narrative of what's going on. We just have them stored in the emotional side, which is where we're going to be experiencing things just through the senses again. So, since the two sides of our brain are no longer communicating with each other, that's what makes traumatic memories kind of come back in pieces that don't necessarily fit together nicely. So, I'm going to end the video just by talking a little bit about what I've been doing to help me through my kind of traumatic memories and the traumas that I've experienced throughout my life. I'm not going to say any of those traumas in detail. I'm just going to be talking a little bit about what therapy looks like for me and what has helped me. It's important to know that there's a lot of different approaches for how to treat trauma, and no one approach is going to work for everybody. So, this is just what works for me, and it might not work for you, but it's something to maybe try and think about or to look into other options that they have in order to treat traumatic events. So basically for me, I do a lot of talk therapy. Talk therapy while working through trauma can be extremely difficult because talking about the trauma can result in flashbacks that you're just not prepared for. Um, for me, if I say something that's like a little bit too in like too much detail basically, or my therapist says something to me that kind of triggers a response in my brain that reminds me of the event, a lot of the times I will get sucked into a flashback. And when you're in a flashback, I talk about this a little bit in my freeze response video as well. When you're in a flashback, your brain can't really separate what's flashback and where you are currently. So there have been times where I've been talking about something and I am suddenly back in whatever time the trauma took place, re experiencing that. Obviously, that is extremely unpleasant, which is why trauma therapy has to be done, usually, if we're doing it this way, has to be done really slowly. Um, you have to be able to kind of slowly work through the flashbacks, help learn grounding skills, things to bring you back while you're in the flashbacks to hopefully decrease their intensity over time the more that you start to talk about them. So again, it's an extremely slow process, but for me, building a narrative of events has been really helpful. When I first started, I was talking mostly about reoccurring nightmares that I had that I didn't really understand. They were just pieces of traumatic events that didn't really seem to get put together, and I couldn't really make sense of them. So that was because they were stored in different places and I didn't have access to that narrative. So through talking about them, I also started talking to through some of the fragmented memories that I had in addition to the nightmares. And then there was a lot of trial and error on how much I could say or what my therapist could say and what would trigger a panic attack. And a lot of the times, once I had gotten through the panic attack or flashback or whatever it was, and was able to kind of ground myself and calm myself back down, something that was extremely helpful for me was looking at what exactly it was that triggered that event. Because all those things gave me more information on what I experienced and how to put together a narrative that was more complete. So even though having panic attacks, having flashbacks feels awful and I hate it so much, looking into the reasons why I was having them really helped me kind of get some more knowledge on what was happening and what exactly it was that was causing me to feel this way. The process of building a more full narrative really helps me because it helps me kind of learn to manage and overcome my triggers. So once I have more of a full story of what happened to me, I can kind of look into my everyday life and figure out what things are going to trigger me and figure out how I can either avoid them or ideally learn to overcome them. So the more I talk about these events in more detail, the less triggering they become. So when I first started therapy for this, about 2.5 years ago now, there was one sentence. If I said one sentence about the event, I would shut down completely. Now I'm able to mostly have a conversation about the event and go into some level of detail without completely shutting down. I still have some times where I get a little bit too deep and I get triggered into a flashback, but a lot of the times has been a lot of improvement from before, when even like the slightest mention of something somewhat related to this would trigger me to just shut down completely, to now I can talk about in detail what was happening to me at the time or things I remembered, or I can tell the story of what happened in a nightmare and I'm able to tell that story from start to finish without shutting down. It's still a process and it's still a really slow and painful process, but the goal is that eventually the trauma and the triggers don't overtake my daily life and I'm able to manage them on my own. So that is it for today's video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm going to link at the end of this video to my video where I talk about the freeze response to trauma if you're interested in learning a little bit more about traumatic responses and kind of what goes on in our brain during traumatic events. There'll be a link to that there. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching and I hope you have a great rest of your day.